The Hawthorne Zenith was a tomb of glass and concrete, a 12-story skeleton of a luxury complex that had been rotting in the city's skyline for 20 years. It was abandoned after a structural collapse in the late 90s, a disaster that allegedly buried several workers alive within its foundation. To the world, it was an eyesore. To Elias, Marcus, and Chloe, it was the ultimate stage for a dare. The air inside the lobby was thick with the scent of wet limestone and the metallic, iron-like tang of oxidized rebar. "The rules are simple," Marcus whispered, his voice unnervingly crisp against the oppressive silence. He was a thrill-seeker, the kind of person who felt most alive when death was a possibility. You stand at the edge of the central elevator shaft, the throat of the building. You close your eyes. You count to 100. They say the zenith is like a giant tuning fork. If you count at the right frequency, the building wakes up to find you. Chloe, an architecture student, traced the jagged cracks in the wall with a trembling finger. "Urban legends are just physics for the superstitious, Marcus." But even she stepped back when they reached the central shaft. It was a square void of absolute darkness that seemed to suck the very light out of their flashlights. Marcus volunteered to be the seeker first. He stood at the precipice, his heels dangling over the abyss. 1, 2, 3. His voice drifted down into the pit, returning seconds later as a distorted, hollower version of itself. Elias and Chloe vanished into the upper floors. Elias scrambled into a narrow maintenance closet on the third floor, surrounded by rusted tools and the smell of stale grease. As the count neared 80, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature plummeted so sharply that Elias's breath turned into thick, white mist. At count 95, Marcus's voice changed. It wasn't Marcus anymore. It was a rhythmic, wet grinding sound, the sound of massive gears trying to rotate through a slurry of gravel and raw, unidentifiable meat. When the count hit 100, a sound like a high-voltage transformer exploding rocked the building. Then, from the bottom of the elevator shaft, a blinding, surgical white light ignited. It was a hungry, clinical glare that scanned the hallways with the precision of a predator's eye. The game had begun, and the building was hungry. Elias watched through the slats of the closet door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The white light was terrifyingly bright, bleaching the world of all color until everything looked like an overexposed photograph. He heard Chloe's breathing. It was coming from the ventilation duct directly above the hallway. She had crawled into the steel tunnels, thinking the metal would protect her. The seeker moved with a sound of dragging rubber and wet suction. It was a towering silhouette draped in tattered industrial plastic, but where its head should have been was a massive, rotating surgical lamp that emitted that soul-searing white glare. The beam swept across the ceiling, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Then, it stopped. It locked onto the vent where Chloe was hiding. A horrific, high-pitched mechanical shriek filled the corridor, a sound that felt like a drill entering Elias's brain. Then came the sound that would haunt his dreams forever. The heavy steel of the ventilation duct began to groan and buckle. It wasn't bending under weight, it was being compressed by an invisible, gravitational vice. Elias watched in paralyzed terror as the rectangular duct began to fold in on itself, twisting like a soda can being crushed by a giant hand. Chloe's scream was short, sharp, and then silenced by a sound so violent it made Elias gag. It was the wet, splintering crack of a human femur snapping into 3 pieces, followed by the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of a spine being forced out of its natural alignment. The metal duct collapsed until it was a flat, jagged ribbon of steel. Dark, viscous blood began to spray from the seams, coating the floor in a steaming, iron-scented mist. Chloe wasn't just dead, she had been filed away into the building's infrastructure, her body forced to occupy a space no thicker than a textbook. Elias fled the closet, his boots slipping on the slick, cooling blood that trailed from the ceiling. He found Marcus on the 5th floor, huddling in the corner of a half-finished kitchen. Marcus was catatonic, his lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer. "It's not a game, Elias," he whimpered, tears carving clean tracks through the dust on his face. "The building, it's hungry for symmetry. It wants us to fit." The white light cut through the doorway like a blade. "Don't move," Elias hissed, but Marcus's panic was a physical force. He bolted for the balcony, his footsteps thundering on the plywood subflooring. The light locked onto him instantly, pinning him against the wall like a moth to a board. The seeker didn't chase him. It simply intensified its glare. Marcus froze in mid-stride, his body locking up as if hit by a massive paralytic dose. The seeker approached, its multi-jointed fingers clicking like a giant insect. It grabbed Marcus by the jaw and the waist with a grip that bruised the bone. Elias watched from behind a drywall pile as Marcus was lifted toward an open electrical junction box on the wall, a metal square no larger than a cigar box. "Please, no!" Marcus shrieked, but the seeker began the folding. It snapped Marcus's legs backward at the hips with a sound like dry firewood breaking. The white light intensified as the seeker twisted his torso, spiraling his ribcage until the bones punctured through the skin in a jagged, red spray. With a wet, rhythmic pulsing, the seeker began stuffing Marcus into the tiny metal box. It was a nightmare of physics, watching a grown man being packed into a space meant for wires. Marcus was still alive, his eyes bulging and bloodshot as his head was forced down between his own shattered shins. The seeker slammed the metal door shut. The screech of metal on bone was unbearable, and 4 of Marcus's fingers were sheared off by the closing door, falling to the dusty floor like discarded scraps of meat. Elias was the only one left. The Zenith was no longer a silent ruin, it was a symphony of muffled, wet thumping coming from within the walls. He realized that to end the game, he had to return to the source, the elevator machine room in the sub-basement. He moved through the shadows, his mind fracturing. Every time the clinical light swept the floor, he felt his own bones begin to throb and ache, as if they were vibrating in sympathy with the building's desire to break them. He reached the 10th floor atrium and looked down into the void. Below him, the seeker patrolled the lobby, its light a lighthouse beam in the heart of a concrete storm. The only way down was the elevator cable, a thick, greasy, frayed wire dangling into the abyss. As he reached for it, his flashlight, clipped to his belt, accidentally clicked on. The seeker's headlamp snapped upward with mechanical speed. The light hit Elias's legs. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. He felt his shin bones begin to bow and warp under an invisible pressure. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across his left fibula with a sickening snap. With a roar of agony, Elias threw himself into the shaft, grabbing the cable. The friction was a nightmare. The steel wire tore through his palms, stripping the skin away in long, bloody ribbons until his raw nerves were screaming against the metal. He slid down 10 stories, the heat of the friction cauterizing his wounds even as it made them. He hit the bottom of the pit in a heap of rusted springs and stagnant, oily water, his hands charred meat, his legs mangled. Elias dragged his broken body into the sub-basement machine room. The Seeker was descending now, floating down the shaft with a heavy, gravitational dread. The white light filled the room, reflecting off the pools of black water and ancient grease. He found the main breaker, the optic nerve of the Zenith. As the Seeker stepped into the room, Elias saw its face clearly for the first time. It wasn't a face. It was a jagged, circular lens made of thousands of human teeth, set into a frame of cracked, yellowed glass. Behind the lens, a massive, glowing eye pulsed with a sickly white fire, the pupil a vertical slit of pure darkness. "Game over," Elias rasped, his voice a bloody cough. He threw the heavy iron lever with the remains of his hands. Total, suffocating darkness. The mechanical shrieking stopped. The pressure in his bones vanished. He lay there for hours in the dark, weeping, listening to the building groan. When the sun finally rose, the Zenith looked like an ordinary ruin again. Elias crawled out into the morning air, his body a map of scars and broken geometry. But as he reached his car and looked into the rearview mirror, the scream died in his throat. His eyes weren't brown anymore. They were two tiny, glowing white pinpricks of light. He looked back at the building, and for a second, the concrete walls became transparent. He saw Marcus in the junction box. He saw Chloe in the vent. Their hearts were still beating, slow and heavy, synced to the rhythm of the city. He realized with a cold, hollow dread that he hadn't won. He had simply graduated. Tonight, he wouldn't be the one hiding. Tonight, Elias would stand at the edge of the pit. Tonight, he would be the one to count to 100, and his voice would be the sound of gears grinding meat. The Zenith had a new eye, and the game would never end.